The moment Rebecca slammed the divorce papers on the kitchen table and screamed at her overweight husband Daniel to pack his bags and take their dying daughter Emma with him, she had no idea that just 3 hours earlier, a team of lawyers in Switzerland had been desperately trying to reach him about the $50 billion empire his estranged uncle had left him. Daniel, a broken man who'd worked double shifts as a janitor at Morrison Tech, while his boss Trevor Morrison seduced his wife in luxury hotels, stood there trembling as Rebecca announced she was marrying Trevor. The very man who'd humiliated him daily, made him clean toilets while other employees laughed, and who now wanted his family. But as Rebecca shoved Daniel toward the door with their feverish 7-year-old daughter clutching her worn teddy bear, as Trevor arrived in his Bentley and spat directly in Daniel's face, while Rebecca laughed and filmed it on her phone, as they drained their joint account of Daniel's life savings to fund their lavish wedding, none of them could have imagined what would happen when that wedding invitation arrived at Daniel's new address. What did the inheritance letter reveal that made Daniel's hands shake? Why did Trevor's face turn white when Daniel walked into that wedding venue? And what kind of revenge could a poor, humiliated janitor possibly unleash that would crush them forever? Daniel Whitmore had always been a big man, not just in weight, but in heart. His 280-pound frame carried years of disappointment, failed diets, and the kind of emotional eating that comes from watching your dreams dissolve one French fry at a time. For 12 years, he'd loved Rebecca Patterson with everything he had, ever since they met at community college where she was studying business, and he was taking night classes while working at a warehouse. Back then, she'd looked at him with something that resembled affection, maybe even love. She'd trace her fingers along his broad shoulders and tell him that his size made her feel safe, protected. They married young, too young probably, in a small ceremony at her parents' church with maybe 40 people in attendance. Daniel's own family didn't come. His mother had died when he was 15, and his father, a bitter alcoholic, had died 2 years into their marriage without ever meeting his granddaughter. Emma arrived 3 years into their marriage, a perfect little girl with Rebecca's green eyes and Daniel's gentle smile. Those first years had been magical despite their financial struggles. Daniel worked wherever he could find employment, and Rebecca managed a small boutique while Emma grew from infant to toddler to the bright-eyed kindergartner who loved butterflies and drawing pictures of their little family. But somewhere around Emma's 5th birthday, things shifted. Rebecca grew distant, critical. She started commenting on Daniel's weight, his lack of ambition, the way he seemed content working blue-collar jobs instead of climbing some corporate ladder. She joined a gym, lost 30 pounds, started wearing makeup to work every day, and coming home later and later. Daniel remembered the first time he met Trevor Morrison. It was 8 months ago when Rebecca announced she'd gotten him an interview at Morrison Tech, a mid-sized software company where she'd recently been hired as an executive assistant to the CEO. Trevor Morrison was everything Daniel wasn't: tall, lean, tanned, with silver hair and a smile that belonged on a billboard. At 45, he had that distinguished look of success, the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits and Swiss watches. The interview had been humiliating. Trevor had looked Daniel up and down, smirked, and offered him a position as a janitor. Rebecca had squeezed Daniel's hand and whispered, "Just take it. We need the money for Emma's medical bills." Because by then, Emma had started getting sick. The headaches came first, then the fatigue, then the nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. The doctors ran tests, then more tests. Pediatric leukemia, they finally said. The words landing like bombs in that sterile hospital room. Stage 2, treatable, but requiring aggressive chemotherapy that their insurance barely covered. Daniel took the janitorial job because Trevor offered health benefits, and he'd have cleaned 1,000 toilets if it meant Emma could get treatment. What he didn't know was that Trevor had been planning this all along, that Rebecca had already been seeing him for 2 months before she arranged Daniel's employment, that every night Daniel spent mopping floors and scrubbing urinals. Trevor was texting his wife obscene messages and planning their future together. The humiliation at Morrison Tech became Daniel's daily bread. Trevor made sure of it. He'd walk past Daniel in the hallways with other executives and make loud comments. "Careful, gentlemen. Wide load coming through. Daniel, you missed a spot, just like you've missed every opportunity in life. The other employees, eager to impress their CEO, would laugh. Some took photos. Daniel found himself as the punchline in the company's group chat, memes of his large frame with cruel captions. He endured it all because Emma needed that insurance, because the chemo was working, because he still believed Rebecca loved him enough to weather this storm together. But Rebecca had already made her choice. She moved through those months with increasing boldness, coming home smelling of expensive cologne, changing her phone password, smiling at texts Daniel couldn't see. He suspected, but couldn't prove, and part of him didn't want to know because knowing would mean losing the last shred of normalcy Emma had. His daughter was fighting for her life, while his wife was falling in love with the man who tormented him daily. The cruelty of it was almost Shakespearean. The flashback that haunted Daniel most was from 6 months ago, before he knew about Trevor and Rebecca's affair. Emma had been having a good day, her white blood cell count up, her energy returned. She'd asked him to take her to the park, just the two of them, daddy-daughter time. Daniel had pushed her on the swings, his big hands gentle on her small back, and she'd laughed, actually laughed for the first time in weeks. "Daddy," she'd said, her voice small and sweet, "when I get better, can we go to Disneyland? Just you and me and Mommy?" Daniel had promised they would, had built that promise up in his mind as something to work toward, something to give meaning to the degradation he endured daily. But even then, Rebecca had been in a hotel room with Trevor, planning her exit, counting the days until Emma's next round of chemo was covered, calculating the exact moment when she could leave without looking like a complete monster. That moment came on a Tuesday evening in late September. Daniel had worked a double shift, cleaning up after a corporate event where Trevor had given a speech about innovation and excellence, while making eye contact with Rebecca the entire time. He'd come home exhausted, his knees aching, his back screaming, to find Emma asleep on the couch with her medication schedule taped to the coffee table. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, her face made up perfectly, wearing a dress he'd never seen before. The divorce papers were already signed on her end, waiting for his signature. A pen sat on top of them like a weapon. "I want a divorce," she said without preamble. "I'm in love with someone else. Someone successful. Someone who isn't an embarrassment." Daniel had stood there, his mind struggling to process the words. "Rebecca, Emma needs..." She'd cut him off. "Emma needs a mother who isn't dying inside, married to a fat failure. Trevor can provide the life I deserve, the life we both deserve." That's when the truth spilled out, every detail designed to wound. The affair had lasted 8 months. Trevor was leaving his own wife. They'd already looked at houses together, expensive ones in gated communities. And the real knife twist, Trevor had only hired Daniel to keep him close, to humiliate him, to make Rebecca's eventual departure even sweeter. "You're taking Emma away from me?" Daniel's voice had broken on their daughter's name. Rebecca's face hardened. "I'm not taking her anywhere. You're taking her. I can't handle a sick child right now, Daniel. Trevor and I are building a new life. Emma needs round-the-clock care that I can't provide while I'm starting over. You'll keep the insurance through the job. I already checked with Trevor. But you need to leave. Tonight." The casual cruelty of it staggered him. She was abandoning their dying daughter to run off with his tormentor. "You can't be serious. Rebecca, she's your daughter." But Rebecca was already standing, already moving toward the door, where, impossibly, Trevor's Bentley was pulling into their driveway. Trevor had walked in like he owned the place, his smile predatory and triumphant. He'd looked at Daniel with pure disdain. "So she told you. Good. Saves me the trouble." Daniel had felt something break inside him then, some fundamental belief in human decency. "You're taking my family." Trevor had laughed, actually laughed. "I'm taking a woman who was never really yours. Face it, Whitmore. You were always just a placeholder, a safe option until someone better came along. And look at you, pathetic, obese, cleaning toilets for a living. What did you think would happen?" That's when Trevor had done it. He'd stepped close, looked Daniel dead in the eye, and spat directly in his face. The saliva had hit Daniel's cheek and dripped down to his chin, while Rebecca stood behind Trevor and laughed, her phone out, recording every second of Daniel's humiliation. "This is going to go viral," she'd said, still laughing. "Fat janitor gets spit on by his wife's boyfriend. "Oh my God, this is gold." Daniel had wiped the spit away with shaking hands, his vision blurring with tears he refused to shed in front of them. "You took everything," he'd whispered. Trevor had shrugged. "Not everything. You still have your daughter and your dignity." "Oh wait, no you don't. You have neither." Then came the final violation. Rebecca logged into their joint bank account on her phone right there in front of him and transferred every penny, $47,000 they'd saved over 12 years. Money from wedding gifts, tax returns, Daniel's overtime, everything, to her personal account. "Consider it payment for 12 years of wasted youth," she'd said. Within an hour, Daniel had been on the street with 2 suitcases, his daughter wrapped in a blanket and crying softly and nowhere to go. Emma, in her fever and confusion, kept asking why Mommy wasn't coming, why they had to leave, if she'd done something wrong. Daniel had carried her to his 15-year-old Honda, secured her in the back seat, and driven to the cheapest motel he could find, paying for 3 nights with the $78 in his wallet. That night, holding Emma while she shook with fever and fear, Daniel hit a bottom he didn't know existed. He'd failed as a husband, couldn't protect his daughter, had no money, no home, no future. He'd sat in that motel bathroom after Emma finally fell asleep and looked at himself in the mirror. Really looked, and seen nothing but a broken man who'd been beaten by life. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he sat in that grimy motel contemplating the darkest thoughts a human can have, was that 3 hours before Rebecca had served him those divorce papers, a law firm in Geneva had been desperately trying to reach him. His father had been the black sheep of the Whitmore family, disowned at 21 for alcoholism and marrying below his class. But Daniel's uncle, Nathaniel Whitmore, had built a fortune that would have been impossible to imagine. Nathaniel had started with a small investment firm in the 1970s, and through brilliant decisions, ruthless business acumen, and remarkable luck, had built an empire spanning pharmaceuticals, tech, real estate, and manufacturing across 4 continents. When Nathaniel died at 78 with no children of his own, his will had specified that everything go to his only nephew, Daniel Whitmore. The lawyers had called Daniel's old number, which was disconnected. They'd gone to his old address, where Rebecca refused them entry and claimed she didn't know where he'd gone. They'd tried Morrison Tech, but Trevor had gleefully told them that Daniel was fired for theft, a lie he'd fabricated the moment Rebecca told him about the divorce. The lawyers were bound by confidentiality and Swiss banking laws, unable to broadcast their search, required to place the information directly into Daniel Whitmore's hands. So they continued searching, hiring investigators, following paper trails while Daniel suffered in a motel room believing he'd lost everything. The wedding invitation arrived at the motel 3 weeks later, forwarded through a complicated mail chain. It was embossed, expensive, the kind of invitation that cost more than Daniel spent on groceries in a month. Trevor Morrison and Rebecca Whitmore request the honor of your presence at their wedding. The date was set for exactly 60 days away. The location, a luxury resort in Napa Valley. Inside, Rebecca had included a handwritten note on perfume stationery. "Daniel, I wanted you to see what a real man's wedding looks like. Trevor insisted we invite you since you were such a big part of our love story. You know, by being such a pathetic husband that you pushed me right into his arms. Please come. It'll be therapeutic for you to see me marry a real success." The cruelty was breathtaking, calculated to inflict maximum pain. They wanted him there to witness his final defeat, to see Rebecca in a designer wedding dress marrying the man who destroyed him, to publicly seal his humiliation. Daniel had sat on the motel bed holding that invitation, Emma asleep beside him after another brutal chemo session, and felt something shift inside him. Not despair this time, but a cold, clarifying rage. They wanted him at their wedding. Fine. He'd be there. What happened next would be impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through those 60 days. The lawyers finally found Daniel through a mistake. Emma's hospital had his current address for billing purposes. When 3 Swiss attorneys in expensive suits knocked on his motel room door, Daniel had assumed they were process servers with more bad news. Instead, they'd handed him documents that rewrote his reality. "Mr. Whitmore, we represent your late uncle's estate. You are the sole beneficiary of holdings valued at approximately $50 billion. The words hadn't made sense at first. Daniel had made them repeat it 3 times. 50 billion, with a B, holdings across multiple countries, investment portfolios, real estate, companies, assets so vast they required a team of accountants to fully catalog. There were conditions, of course. Nathaniel had been eccentric, disappointed by how wealth corrupted people. His will stipulated that Daniel couldn't reveal his inheritance to anyone for 90 days. Time meant to see who stood by him when he had nothing. After 90 days, he'd gain full control. Until then, the lawyers would manage everything. But Daniel would have access to unlimited funds through secure channels. More importantly, Nathaniel had left specific instructions about vengeance. If anyone had wronged Daniel during his poverty, Nathaniel's will authorized the use of estate resources to deliver justice. The old man had apparently been betrayed enough times in his life to understand the value of settling scores. Daniel's transformation began immediately, but quietly. He moved Emma into a private hospital suite under a false name, hired the best pediatric oncologists in the world, secured experimental treatments not available to the public. Within 2 weeks, Emma's condition stabilized, then improved. The joy in his daughter's eyes as her energy returned, as she started playing again, laughing again, was worth more than all $50 billion. He told her they'd received help from a charity, that everything would be okay now, that Daddy was going to fix everything, and he meant it. For Trevor and Rebecca's wedding, Daniel planned something they'd never forget. He hired investigators who uncovered Trevor's entire business history, the embezzlement, the SEC violations he'd covered up, the mistresses he'd paid off, the company funds he'd diverted to offshore accounts. Rebecca's background revealed its own surprises. Credit card fraud from her early 20s, false insurance claims, a pattern of seducing and manipulating wealthy men. Daniel compiled it all into a dossier that would destroy them both, but he wouldn't release it. Not yet. First, they needed to see him. They needed to understand what they'd thrown away. The 60 days passed in careful preparation. Daniel used his uncle's resources to not just survive, but to engineer perfect revenge. He bought Morrison Tech through a shell corporation, appointed new management with instructions to investigate Trevor's finances. He purchased the luxury resort where the wedding would take place. He acquired the company that printed their wedding invitations. Every detail of their celebration would be touched by the man they'd spat on, laughed at, destroyed. And they'd have no idea until the perfect moment. On the wedding day, Trevor and Rebecca stood at an altar decorated with $200,000 worth of flowers, surrounded by 300 guests who represented the social elite they so desperately wanted to join. Rebecca wore a Vera Wang dress that cost more than Daniel used to make in a year. Trevor looked smug in his custom Italian tuxedo, already half drunk on expensive champagne, making jokes to his groomsmen about his fat ex-janitor and how pathetic it would be if Daniel actually showed up. Imagine, Trevor slurred to the best man, that loser walking in here. What's he going to do? Clean our toilets? The groomsmen laughed, glasses clinked, and Rebecca preened in front of mirrors, believing she'd finally achieved the life she deserved. Then Daniel walked in, but not the Daniel they remembered. In 60 days, with access to the world's best trainers, nutritionists, and surgeons, Daniel had transformed. He'd lost 80 pounds through intensive work and surgical assistance. He wore a Tom Ford tuxedo that fit his still large but now powerful frame perfectly. His hair was professionally cut, his beard trimmed and distinguished. He moved with confidence, flanked by 2 attorneys and a security team. The room fell silent as he walked down the aisle, every eye turning to watch. Rebecca saw him first and actually gasped, her face going white. Trevor turned, his champagne glass slipping from his fingers to shatter on the marble floor. "Hello, Rebecca." "Trevor," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the suddenly quiet venue. "Thank you for inviting me to your special day. I wouldn't have missed it for anything." Rebecca tried to speak, but no words came. Trevor recovered first, his face flushing red with anger and something else. Fear. "What the hell are you doing here, Whitmore? Security—" But Daniel held up a hand, and the security team, his security team, all employees of the resort he now owned, stepped forward. I own this venue, Trevor. I own the company you work for, or rather worked for, as you were terminated this morning for embezzlement. I own the bank that holds your mortgage, and I have something for you both. One of the attorneys stepped forward and handed Rebecca and Trevor each a folder. Inside were the divorce papers Rebecca had forced Daniel to sign, now voided because she'd committed fraud by draining their joint account before the divorce was finalized. Also inside were criminal complaints filed with the district attorney, fraud, embezzlement, identity theft. Bank statements showing where their stolen money had gone. Photographs of Trevor with various mistresses, times and dates stamped. Rebecca's credit card fraud from years ago. Statute of limitations not yet expired. Everything that would destroy them, laid out in meticulous detail. The police are waiting outside, Daniel said quietly. You're both under arrest. The wedding is canceled, your assets are frozen, and Emma, our daughter Rebecca, the one you abandoned when she was dying, she's in remission now. Fully in remission, thanks to treatments I was able to afford through an inheritance you knew nothing about. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Inheritance? Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel smiled, and it wasn't kind. $50 billion. Inherited 3 hours before you kicked me out. The lawyers were trying to reach me while you were filming Trevor, spit in my face. All you had to do was love me, Rebecca. Love our daughter. Be a decent human being. Instead, you chose this. He gestured at Trevor, who stood frozen, his face ashen. Was it worth it? Was he worth losing $50 billion? Worth abandoning Emma? Worth becoming a criminal? Rebecca's legs gave out and she collapsed in her expensive wedding dress, tears streaming down her face, completely destroyed. Trevor tried to run, but security caught him at the door. As police led them both away in handcuffs, Daniel stood in the center of that ruined wedding venue and felt not triumph, but a deep, profound sadness for who they might have been if they'd chosen differently. He'd won, but victory tasted like ashes because Emma still had to grow up knowing her mother had abandoned her, because cruelty had scarred all of them, because revenge didn't actually heal the wounds they'd inflicted. But it was justice, cold and complete. And as Daniel walked out into the California sunshine, his phone rang with Emma's voice, asking when Daddy would be back to read her bedtime story. He realized he'd gained something more valuable than revenge. He'd gained the chance to give his daughter the life she deserved. The rest, all of it, was just money and justice. His real wealth was sleeping in a hospital bed, healthy and loved, waiting for him to come home. 5 years later, Daniel Whitmore stood in the doorway of Emma's bedroom, watching his 12-year-old daughter sleep peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. The butterfly nightlight she'd insisted on keeping cast gentle shadows across walls decorated with artwork she'd created herself. Vibrant paintings of families, gardens, and hope. On her desk sat a framed photograph from last month's trip to Disneyland. The promise he'd made in that park 6 years ago finally fulfilled. Emma was cancer-free, had been for 4.5 years, and the doctors used words like miracle and complete remission with increasing confidence. The house, a modest 4-bedroom in a quiet suburb, nothing like the mansions his wealth could afford, was filled with the comfortable silence of contentment. Daniel had learned that money couldn't buy happiness, but it could remove the obstacles that prevented it. He'd established the Emma Whitmore Foundation, dedicating $3 billion to pediatric cancer research and providing free treatment to families who couldn't afford it. Hundreds of children were alive because of resources he directed toward finding better treatments, gentler chemotherapies, innovative approaches that gave families hope instead of bankruptcy. Morrison Tech had been restructured completely. Daniel kept it running but transformed its culture, firing every executive who'd participated in workplace bullying, implementing strict anti-harassment policies, and tripling the salaries of janitorial and support staff. The company was now known as a model workplace, and Daniel visited quarterly, always making time to shake hands with the cleaning crew and thank them personally. Some of the same people who'd laughed at him 5 years ago now worked under his ownership, and while he could have fired them all, he'd chosen a different path, giving them the chance to be better than they'd been, the chance Rebecca and Trevor had refused. Speaking of Rebecca and Trevor, Their fates had unfolded exactly as the evidence predicted. Trevor served 4 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud before being released on parole. His ex-wife had taken everything in their divorce. His reputation was destroyed, and he now worked as a regional manager at a car rental company, his dreams of wealth and status reduced to helping tourists find economy sedans. Daniel had made sure Trevor's parole officer knew about any violations, not out of cruelty, but because consequences mattered. Trevor was alive, free to rebuild if he chose, but he'd never again have the power to destroy someone's life on a whim. Rebecca's story was more complicated. She'd served 2 years in a minimum security facility for fraud, and when she was released, she'd attempted to contact Emma through the courts. Daniel had given his daughter the choice, now 10 years old and wise beyond her years, and Emma had thought about it for a long time before saying, "Maybe someday, Daddy, but not now. I'm not ready." Daniel had supported that decision completely. Though he'd set aside money in a trust that Emma could access at 18, money that Rebecca could never touch, but that might help his daughter if she ever chose to build some kind of relationship with her mother. Last Daniel heard, Rebecca was living in Arizona, working as a paralegal, attending therapy twice a week, and by all accounts trying to become a better person. Whether that transformation was genuine or just survival instinct, Daniel didn't know and had stopped caring. His capacity for revenge had been exhausted in that wedding venue, and what remained was simply a wish that she'd find some kind of peace, for Emma's sake if nothing else. Daniel himself had changed in ways that had nothing to do with weight loss or wealth. He'd spent 3 years in therapy, working through the trauma of betrayal, the wounds of humiliation, the complicated grief of losing a marriage to cruelty. He'd learned that being a good father meant showing Emma how to process pain without letting it poison you, how to set boundaries without building walls, how to forgive without forgetting. He dated occasionally, carefully, always honest about his past and his priorities, but nothing serious had developed yet. Emma came first, and any woman who entered their lives would need to understand that. On weekends, Daniel volunteered at a shelter for families experiencing homelessness, never forgetting those nights in a cheap motel when he'd had nothing. He'd established scholarship programs for community college students, remembering how education had once been his only hope for something better. He'd become a different kind of wealthy person than his Uncle Nathaniel, not isolated and suspicious, but engaged and generous, believing that money was a tool for reducing suffering rather than a scoreboard for measuring worth. As he closed Emma's door and walked downstairs to his study, Daniel passed the mirror in the hallway and caught his reflection. He'd kept most of the weight off, not through obsession, but through healthy habits born from wanting to be alive and active for his daughter's future. The man looking back at him was 42 years old, graying at the temples with smile lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He looked like someone who'd survived a war and learned something from it. On his desk sat the wedding invitation that had started everything, preserved now in a frame, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Beneath it, Emma had placed a drawing she'd made last year, a stick figure of a large man holding the hand of a small girl, both smiling with the words, "My hero daddy," written in crayon across the top. That was the revenge he'd never planned for, the victory he'd never anticipated, being loved purely and completely by someone who saw past his flaws, to the father who'd never abandoned her, even when her mother had. Daniel picked up his phone and scrolled to a text from Emma's oncologist. "All clear on today's scans. See you in 6 months. She's a miracle, Daniel." He read it again, let the relief wash over him again, and then did something he'd done every night for 5 years. He went to the small chapel he'd built in the garden, a quiet space with stained glass windows depicting butterflies, and he gave thanks. Not to his uncle's money, not to his successful revenge, not even to justice served, but to the simple, profound gift of his daughter's laughter echoing through their home, healthy and whole in his. That was the inheritance that mattered. Everything else was just the story of how he'd earned the right to keep it.